Before we get into the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each story reveals secrets that many places prefer to keep hidden. And feel free to comment on where you're watching from right now. Sometimes, the place from which we hear a story says a lot about how it affects us. The house was located in Atchison, Kansas, a Victorian building too ordinary to arouse suspicion. Light paint, a narrow porch, windows aligned with an almost welcoming symmetry. To those passing by on North 2nd Street, it seemed just another old residence surviving the passage of time. But something was wrong there. Not in what one saw, but in what one felt after lingering too long. In 1992, Deborah Pickman and her husband Tony moved into the house seeking tranquility. He was skeptical, practical, accustomed to trusting only what he could measure or touch. Deborah, more sensitive, noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere, small variations in mood that she couldn't explain. From the first night, the air felt heavy, as if the house were watching their every move. The conflict didn't arise immediately. It seeped in slowly, like an invisible leak. Objects began to shift. Doors that were closed appeared ajar. The clock in the room was always slow at the same time, nothing that, in isolation, justified fear. But the combination created a persistent feeling of intrusion. Tony insisted on rational explanations. The house was old, he said. Wood warped, structures creaked. The neighborhood had a history of electrical problems. He wrote everything down, as if recording the events were enough to control them. Deborah, on the other hand, felt that something didn't want to be controlled. It wanted to be perceived. The nights were the worst. The room temperature would change abruptly, becoming too cold for the season. Deborah would wake up with the clear feeling of not being alone. She didn't see anyone, but she felt a specific weight on her chest, as if something were very close, watching her breath. When she touched her husband to wake him, the sensation disappeared, leaving only fear and silence. The first physical sign appeared without warning. Scratches appeared on the walls of the children's bedroom, a room they hardly ever used, deep, irregular marks, as if fingernails had been dug in with excessive force. Tony tried to reproduce the grooves with tools. None produced the same pattern. Still, he didn't give up. He preferred to think of it as old vandalism or flaws in the wood. The house seemed to react differently to each of them. With Tony, the events were subtle, almost provocative. With Deborah, they became aggressive. She began to hear footsteps in the hallway when she was alone, low, childlike laughter that ceased as soon as she moved. There was no echo, no clear origin, only the certainty that the sound wasn't coming from outside. The name Sallie first appeared unexpectedly. One night, Deborah woke up with the distinct impression that someone was whispering near her ear. It wasn't a complete sentence, just a name repeated insistently, laden with something that didn't seem human. The next day, while researching old records of the house, it was discovered that a girl named Sallie had died there at the beginning of the 20th century after a botched surgery. This information did not bring relief, it brought confirmation. The house was not just old, it held something that had not been closed off. The attacks intensified. Tony began to develop cuts on his body, appearing during sleep. Linear, parallel marks, too deep to be explained by involuntary movements. He would wake up confused, in pain, and with blood on the sheets. Still, he refused to leave. For him, abandoning the house meant admitting that something beyond logic had power over his life. Tension between the couple grew, not in words, but in actions. Tony spent more time away, investigating, installing cameras, calling in experts. Deborah avoided certain rooms, especially the basement, where the air seemed thicker and the feeling of hostility was constant. The house seemed to choose its targets, reacting differently to each presence. Nothing there seemed random. Each event arose as a response to prolonged stay, as if the space demanded something in return. There was no clear warning, only escalation. Sallie House didn't manifest itself to frighten occasional visitors. It waited, it observed, and when it decided to act, it did so in a personal way. What began as discomfort was turning into something far more dangerous. The house didn't want to be investigated. It wanted to be respected or obeyed, and no one there yet fully understood the price of that. Atchison was a town that seemed to live suspended in time. The narrow streets, the 19th century houses, and the nighttime silence created a sense of permanence, as if nothing there truly changed. Sallie House fit into this setting with unsettling precision. It didn't attract attention, it didn't stand out, and perhaps that's precisely why it was ignored for so long. Deborah began to observe the house as one tries to decipher a living organism. Each room had a different weight. The living room, bright during the day, became oppressive at nightfall. The children's room was the most disturbing. The air seemed stagnant, and the temperature rarely matched the rest of the house. It was there that noises arose most frequently. There were no personal objects, toys, or furniture that justified that constant presence, and yet the room seemed occupied. Tony reacted differently. He transformed fear into a method. He bought books on local history, property records, old hospital files. He discovered that at the beginning of the 20th century, a doctor had treated a seriously ill child in that house. The surgery had been performed without adequate anesthesia. The girl had died during the procedure. The name Sallie appeared in some accounts, but never conclusively. Nothing officially documented, only scattered contradictory mentions. This uncertainty fueled the conflict between reason and experience. For Tony, the absence of concrete evidence weakened the supernatural narrative. For Deborah, it was precisely this gap that made everything more threatening. Something unrecorded was not non-existent, just unrecognized. The house seemed to react when these matters were investigated. Whenever Tony brought in new documents or spoke aloud about Sallie, small incidents would occur, sharp knocks on the walls, objects falling for no apparent reason. Once, a Bible was thrown from the shelf with enough force to hit the opposite wall. The impact left visible marks on the plaster. Secondary characters began to enter the story, each adding new layers to the mystery. Longtime neighbors avoided talking about the house. Some looked away when questioned. Others offered vague answers, mentioning only that nobody stayed there for very long. A former resident said he had heard footsteps during the early morning hours, but had never seen anything. He moved away after a few months, without explaining the exact reason. Paranormal investigators were called in. Modern equipment contrasted sharply with the ancient architecture. Recorders picked up noises that didn't correspond to clear human voices, only irregular sounds like distorted breathing or murmurs. Motion sensors went off in empty rooms. Still, no evidence was definitive enough to satisfy Tony. Sallie House seemed to resist any attempt at straightforward explanation. Nothing there was repeated in the same way. The pattern lay precisely in the absence of pattern. The house adapted to the people, not the other way around. Deborah began to change. She became quieter, more attentive to detail. She avoided prolonged contact with any cold surface. She spent most of her time outside, but always returned reluctantly, as if the house were calling her back. There was a constant feeling of being watched, especially when she was alone. It wasn't pure fear. It was something more complex, a mixture of repulsion and involuntary attraction. Tony, in turn, began to lose control of his own narrative. The physical assaults became more frequent. Scratches, bruises, cuts that appeared during the night. He started sleeping with the lights on and cameras running. Some recordings showed shadows moving rapidly, distortions that he attributed to technical glitches. Still, he didn't turn off the equipment. The antagonist in the story didn't present itself as a clear entity. There was no defined form, nor explicit rules. The house didn't attack impulsively. It seemed to choose specific moments, as if testing limits. With Tony, the attacks were direct, almost defiant. With Deborah, they were psychological, persistent, and exhausting. The local culture, marked by tales of haunted houses and stories passed down orally, reinforced the idea that certain places hold memories of suffering. In Atchison, this wasn't treated as distant folklore, but as something accepted with resignation. Sallie House was just another one of those places, except that it was still active. The relationship between the two was silently deteriorating. There weren't constant arguments, but rather conflicting decisions. Tony wanted to stay to prove something. Deborah wanted to leave to survive. The house, still and silent during the day, seemed to watch this deterioration with patience. The more one tried to understand Sallie House, the clearer it became that she didn't need to be understood in order to act. She existed within her own rules. And everyone there was, little by little, being forced to play by them. The change in the household's behavior didn't happen abruptly. It crept into the details, the small flaws in the routine that began to accumulate until they became impossible to ignore. What had previously seemed like resistance now took the form of confrontation. The demonstrations began to occur during the day as well. Deborah realized this when she heard footsteps upstairs while washing the dishes. The sound was slow, heavy, as if someone were walking with difficulty. Upon going upstairs, she found only silence and the clear feeling of having been watched. There was no surprise or relief, only the confirmation that the house no longer respected schedules. Tony intensified his attempts to gain control. He installed more cameras, sensors, and automatic lights. Each new device seemed to provoke an immediate response. Alarms went off without any movement being recorded. The cameras showed interference precisely at the most critical moments. In one recording, a door slammed shut on its own with enough force to shake the house's structure without any system being activated. The relationship between the couple entered a stage of constant tension. It was no longer a question of believing or not. It was a silent struggle over who would give in first. Tony refused to leave, convinced that abandoning the house would mean losing something he couldn't yet name. Deborah began sleeping in hotels some nights, returning only to retrieve belongings or check if everything remained in its place. Each return seemed to leave the house more aggressive. Secondary characters began to suffer indirect consequences. A friend who was helping Tony install equipment refused to return after feeling intense pressure in his chest while in the basement. A paranormal investigator claimed to have seen a small, motionless figure in the corner of the children's room. Upon trying to approach, he felt nauseous and experienced a sharp pain in his head. He ended the visit early, avoiding detailed explanations. The basement became the epicenter of the conflict. The air there was colder, denser, as if isolated from the rest of the house. Deborah avoided going down, but Tony began to focus his investigations in that space. One night, while analyzing equipment, he felt a violent impact on his back, followed by deep cuts that appeared almost instantly. Blood flowed across the concrete floor before he could react. This attack marked a clear shift. It was no longer provocation, it was direct hostility. The house began to act selectively. When Tony was alone, the physical attacks intensified. When Deborah returned, the atmosphere became oppressive, too silent, as if something was waiting. Her personal belongings disappeared and reappeared in unlikely places. Old photographs surfaced, torn, always involving family images. The name Sallie began to appear in unexpected ways, written in the dust, whispered in recordings, murmured in moments of near silence. There was no clear voice, only fragments, as if the house were trying to communicate something without allowing full comprehension. Tony began to show signs of physical and psychological exhaustion. His sleep was irregular, his body marked by unexplained injuries, yet his posture grew more rigid, more stubborn. He no longer reacted with surprise to the attacks, only with contained anger. The house seemed to feed off this resistance. Deborah, on the other hand, began to feel something different from fear. There were moments when the presence seemed to approach without aggression, almost curious. One quiet afternoon, sitting in the nursery, she felt a light pressure on her hand, like a quick, hesitant touch. There was no pain, no intense cold, just a brief contact, enough to leave her paralyzed. This difference in treatment deepened the conflict between the two. Tony saw the house as an enemy to be challenged. Deborah was beginning to perceive something more complex, not exactly a child, but also not a purely hostile entity. The house reacted not only to human presence, but to intentions. The fragile balance that still existed began to crumble when Tony decided to spend an entire night alone in the basement, determined to capture definitive proof. The cameras recorded only static for hours. When Deborah returned the following morning, she found the basement ransacked, equipment destroyed, and Tony unconscious on the floor, covered in recent cuts. He survived, but something had changed, not just in the house, in him. The conflict, which had previously been external, was beginning to seep into the characters themselves. Sallie House no longer needed to constantly attack. She had already created enough division, attrition, and doubt for the confrontation to escalate on its own. As the main conflict intensified, other layers began to reveal themselves, inevitably intertwining with the presence of the house. Nothing there happened in isolation. Each new element seemed to emerge to deepen the tension, never to alleviate it. One of the most disturbing subplots involved the reaction of the local community. Deborah noticed that some residents began to avoid her. Conversations ceased when she approached. An older neighbor, after much insistence, admitted that the house was known for not liking men who tried to control it. He didn't explain what he meant. He simply recommended that they leave before the choice was made. Upon hearing this comment, Tony reacted with irritation. He began investigating old police and hospital records with even greater obsession. He discovered unofficial accounts from other residents who had abruptly left the house, some after serious domestic accidents, others after intense psychological crises. No record explicitly mentioned confirmed deaths, but all mentioned injuries, persistent fear, and the feeling of being followed even after moving out. Another subplot developed from the recordings. An audio specialist called in by Tony identified patterns in the captured noises. They weren't complete voices, but fragments that repeated themselves with slight variations. In some parts, the sound resembled a restrained cry. In others, something more aggressive, almost a muffled growl. The alternation between these two extremes raised a disturbing possibility. Perhaps there wasn't just one presence there. Deborah began to experience lapses in time, moments when she couldn't remember exactly what she had done inside the house. Small objects appeared in her pockets without explanation. An old key, a piece of children's fabric, an old coin. None of it was there when she entered. The house seemed to envelop her in a more subtle, less violent, but equally dangerous way. Time pressure began to manifest itself concretely. Tony received an informal ultimatum from work. His frequent absences and compromised physical state were becoming a problem. Deborah, emotionally exhausted, began to consider leaving town permanently, with or without him. The length of stay at Sallie House was no longer just a choice, it was becoming a cumulative risk. The relationship between the two reached a critical point. There wasn't a major argument, just a gradual distancing. Tony started sleeping in the basement. Deborah avoided staying in the house after sunset. Their cohabitation became functional, devoid of intimacy. The house seemed to respond to this distance with a strange calm, as if it were satisfied with the division it had created. A new complexity arose when Deborah began to feel empathy for the presence. At times, the hostility gave way to a feeling of profound sadness. There were no clear images, only emotions that didn't seem to belong to her. The pain, the confusion, the feeling of having been unjustly hurt. These emotions surfaced with greater intensity in the children's room. Tony, upon noticing this change, interpreted it as manipulation. To him, the house was using Deborah as a means of access, weakening his defenses. This perception increased his aggression. He began to verbally confront the house, challenging it loudly, demanding answers. Each confrontation was followed by new physical attacks. The subplots slowly converged on a single point. The house no longer needed to prove its existence. It had already become integrated into their lives, influencing decisions, emotions, and relationships. Time was running out, and any choice made from that moment on would have irreversible consequences. Sallie House didn't act hastily. It waited for complete exhaustion, and as the subplots closed in around the central conflict, it became clear that someone there would be forced to give in, not out of fear, but out of burnout. The turning point didn't come as an isolated event, but as an inevitable convergence of everything that had been accumulating. The house seemed to have been waiting for the exact moment when the emotional, physical, and psychological strain reached an irreversible limit. The change began on a night that was too quiet. There were no noises, no power outages, no interference with the equipment. The total absence of any activity created a tension more intense than any previous attack. Tony realized this immediately. The calm wasn't normal. It was strategic. He decided to go down to the basement shortly before midnight, ignoring the cameras that had stopped recording clear images. The air was colder than ever. Each step echoed as if the space were larger than it actually was. It was there that he found something that hadn't been recorded before. A small opening in the wall, partially hidden behind an old bookcase. Inside, there were objects that didn't belong to any recent resident. Old, rusty medical instruments, cloths stiffened by time, and dark stains that left no doubt about their origin. Among them, an incomplete, almost illegible medical record mentioning an emergency surgery performed on a child named Sallie. The date matched the fragmented accounts Tony had found months earlier. The revelation was immediate and brutal. The presence wasn't just a lingering memory. There was unresolved pain, poorly explained violence, abandonment, but the discovery didn't bring empathy, it brought confrontation. Tony felt there was finally something concrete, something he could expose, catalogue, prove. The attack happened the moment he touched the objects. There was no warning. The force was direct, overwhelming. Tony was thrown against the wall with enough violence to knock the air from his lungs. Deep cuts appeared on his arms and back, more intense than any previous attack. The pain was immediate, but what was most disturbing was the clear sense of intent. It wasn't loss of control. It was a response. Meanwhile, upstairs, Deborah woke up with an oppressive feeling, as if the house were closing in around her. The name Sallie wasn't whispered this time. It was imposed, repeated urgently, mixed with images that weren't her memories. A child immobilized, hands holding her with excessive force, absolute fear. Deborah rushed down the stairs in a panic, guided by something she didn't fully understand. She found Tony lying in the basement, bleeding, surrounded by the exposed objects. Seeing them, she felt a wave of revulsion and profound sadness. This wasn't just evidence. It was desecration. At that moment, Deborah's perception changed irreversibly. The house wasn't protecting an innocent spirit. It was preserving the violence that had created it. The entity manifesting as Sallie wasn't just a child. It was the result of the trauma, pain, and anger accumulated in that space. The revelation affected them both in opposite ways. Tony, even though wounded, felt he was closer to the truth than ever before. Deborah, on the other hand, realized that the more she tried to reveal herself, the more aggressively the house reacted. There was no liberation there, only repetition. The presence intensified in an unprecedented way. The walls vibrated, objects were thrown around the basement, and the feeling of confinement became suffocating. For the first time, Deborah was certain that the house didn't want them to leave. It wanted them to choose between confronting or retreating, between exposing or preserving, between surviving or proving something. The tipping point had been established. From that moment on, neutrality was no longer possible. Any decision made from then on would define not only the outcome of the story, but who they would become at the end of it. Sallie House had made it clear. The next reaction would not be a warning. The consequences of what happened in the basement weren't immediate, but they spread through the house like a slow contamination. The silence that followed the attack was heavy, laden with something irreversible. Tony survived, but his body no longer reacted as before. The cuts took a long time to heal. The pain remained, even when there were no visible wounds. Deborah began to treat the house with absolute caution. She didn't confront, didn't provoke, didn't investigate. Every movement was calculated, as if she were living with something unpredictable, yet alert to any slip-up. The presence seemed to respond to this change with constant vigilance, without direct aggression, but with a continuous pressure that made it difficult to breathe. Tony reacted in the opposite way. The discovery of the objects and the incomplete medical record had broken something inside him. There was no more skepticism, only obsession. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always about proving what he had found. He began to photograph everything, to organize the materials, even with his weakened body. The house seemed to allow this activity, which made everything even more unsettling. The relationship between the two entered a state of tense coexistence. There were no direct accusations, only unilateral decisions. Deborah began sleeping out more frequently. Tony remained alone in the house for long periods. Each of her returns was marked by a clear sense of disapproval, as if the space reacted to her presence with silent displeasure. External reactions began to manifest. A doctor who treated Tony suggested that the injuries were not consistent with common accidents. He offered no alternative explanations. He only recommended that he avoid environments that caused extreme stress. The recommendation was ignored. Investigators who had previously shown interest backed down after learning of the attack in the basement. No one wanted to associate their name with a case that seemed to be beyond their control. Sallie House was beginning to acquire a more concrete, less folkloric reputation. Deborah, emotionally exhausted, began to feel that the house didn't want her as a victim, but as a witness. At times, the hostility gave way to a silent, almost expectant presence. There was no comfort in that. Only the feeling of being watched with constant attention. Tony began to suffer lapses of consciousness inside the house. He lost track of time, waking up in different rooms with new injuries. Even so, he showed no fear, only a rigid, almost mechanical determination. The house seemed to react to this posture with increasingly targeted attacks. The consequences of the turning point extended beyond the walls of Sallie House. Deborah began to fear not only the house, but what Tony was becoming. Obsession had replaced the survival instinct. He no longer reacted as someone trying to escape, but as someone willing to sacrifice himself for an incomplete truth. Tensions reached a new level when Deborah realized the house seemed to favor this transformation. The physical aggressions lessened as Tony delved deeper into the investigation. It was as if the entity recognized something familiar in that obstinacy, a repetition of the initial violence that had given rise to everything. Sallie House no longer needed to attack as frequently. The consequences were already in motion. The physical exhaustion, the emotional isolation, and the growing obsession were doing their work for her. From that moment on, it became clear that the greatest danger no longer came only from the house, but from the choices being made within it. Overcoming this didn't begin as an act of courage, but as a silent necessity. Deborah realized that remaining in a constant state of reaction was leading her to the same exhaustion that consumed Tony. If she continued to simply avoid the house, she would be swallowed up by the same dynamic that fueled her presence there. She decided to return to Sallie House permanently for a limited time, not to investigate nor to confront, but to observe. She changed her own routine, staying only during the day and avoiding the spaces where the pressure was most intense. This change subtly altered the house's behavior. The direct hostility diminished, replaced by a restrained, almost cautious presence. Deborah began recording emotions, not events. She noted physical sensations, changes in temperature, variations in the air. She realized that the presence reacted less to the occupation of space and more to the intention behind it. When she entered with fear or defiance, the house responded with pressure. When she entered in silence and attentiveness, the reaction was less aggressive. This understanding marked the beginning of her transformation. Deborah stopped trying to decipher the entity as something external. She began to see it as a reflection of accumulated violence, not as a child, but as a permanent state of pain. This did not generate full empathy, but it brought clarity. Tony, on the other hand, began to face insurmountable physical limitations. His body could no longer sustain long periods of investigation. A fainting spell in the basement forced him to acknowledge, albeit reluctantly, that he no longer had control of the situation. For the first time, he agreed to leave the house for a few days, leaving his belongings and records behind. This absence had an immediate effect. The house became unstable. Noises arose without pattern. Doors slammed violently. The air pressure increased. The presence seemed to react to Tony's departure as to a broken expectation. He wasn't just a target, he was part of the dynamic. During this period, Deborah realized something crucial. The house didn't want liberation nor justice. It wanted continuity. It reacted to those who tried to interrupt the cycle of violence, but calmed down in the presence of those who became part of it. This realization forced Deborah to grow in a painful way. Overcoming it wasn't about confronting the entity, but about breaking the logic that sustained it. She began to plan a definitive exit, not as an escape, but as an interruption. Tony resisted the idea at first, but something within him had changed. The obsession no longer offered answers, only exhaustion. He began to realize that each attempt to prove something strengthened his presence. The house didn't need to be challenged. It needed to be freed from conflict. Their growth was uneven but convergent. Deborah gained emotional clarity. Tony lost the illusion of control. Neither emerged unscathed from this process, but both began to act differently, less reactive, more conscious. Sallie House responded with silence. A dense, attentive silence, as if awaiting the next move. There were no attacks, no clear demonstrations, only the constant feeling that the final decision was near. The ordeal wasn't over. But for the first time since they entered that house, they were no longer being swept along by events. They were preparing to act, even without knowing exactly what the cost would be. The decision to leave Sallie House did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, the preparation for departure transformed the last days in the house into a period of constant tension, as if every action was being observed and evaluated. There were no direct attacks, but the atmosphere reacted to each attempt at closure. Deborah began packing only the essentials. Personal belongings, documents, clothes, everything that carried direct memories of the house was left behind. Photographs taken there were torn up. Notes made inside the rooms were discarded. She sensed that taking any fragment of that space could prolong the connection. Tony resolved the practical matters with difficulty. He cancelled contracts, organized the records he intended to keep, and left the objects in the basement exactly where they were. For the first time, he didn't try to document anything new. Every movement was restrained, almost ritualistic, as if the simple act of resisting the impulse to investigate was a form of confrontation. The house reacted subtly, yet steadily. Doors that had remained closed for months began to open on their own. The children's room once again experienced extreme temperature fluctuations. The name Sallie was no longer whispered. It surfaced in intrusive thoughts, imposing itself on the mind, especially when Deborah considered leaving for good. Subplots began to quietly wrap up. Researchers withdrew completely. Neighbors began to observe the house with restrained curiosity, as if sensing that something was about to end. Tony's work was no longer a source of pressure. Everything seemed to converge on a single final event. On the last planned night at the house, Deborah noticed a clear change in the air. It wasn't aggression, it was anticipation. The presence seemed concentrated, as if gathering strength. The feeling didn't come from a specific room, but from the entire structure. Every wall, every step, every door seemed to vibrate slightly. Tony felt it too. For the first time, he didn't try to rationalize. He simply acknowledged that the moment of indirect confrontation was over. The house wouldn't accept a quiet exit. Something needed to be concluded there. They spent the night awake, sitting in the living room, without exchanging many words. There was nothing left to discuss. The decisions had already been made. The preparation didn't involve rituals, prayers, or verbal confrontations. It involved resisting provocation, curiosity, and fear. Around dawn, the first signs appeared. Flashing lights, the distant sound of something dragging itself down the hallway, the pressure in the air becoming almost physical. No attack, just the clear promise that the silence was about to be broken. Sallie House wasn't trying to prevent the exit. He was demanding one last acknowledgement, a final moment that would seal the relationship between occupants and space. The preparation for the climax was complete. There were no more intermediate choices. The next manifestation would be definitive and would allow no hesitation. The climax began without a precise breaking point. There was no initial bang, nor a single event marking the beginning. Sallie House simply stopped containing what had been accumulating. Silence was replaced by continuous movement, as if the entire house had awakened from a prolonged wait. The lights went out all at once, not in isolated flickers, but in a complete blackout. The air became thick, difficult to breathe. The sensation wasn't one of extreme cold or heat, but of compression, as if space were closing in around them. The walls creaked unevenly, not like old wood, but like something being forced beyond its limit. Deborah immediately sensed that the manifestation wasn't directed at her. The pressure was focused on Tony. He remained motionless in the center of the room, breathing heavily, while old cuts on his body began to burn as if they were being reopened from the inside. There were no new marks, only intense, focused pain. The name Sallie echoed through the house, not like a child's voice, but like a distorted, multiplied sound, impossible to pinpoint. It wasn't coming from a specific room, it was coming from the structure. Tony fell to his knees, feeling the invisible impact of something pressing him against the floor. At that moment, the final revelation was brutally imposed. Deborah realized that the entity reacted not only to human presence, but to the role each person assumed. Tony had become a repetition of the original trauma, someone who investigated, exposed, touched, insisted on understanding without considering the pain involved. The house didn't see him as a common intruder, but as a continuation of the violence. Sallie House didn't choose victims randomly. It chose surrogates. Tony tried to get up, but was thrown against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The house wasn't attacking him to kill him, but to mark him, to fix him there, physically and symbolically. He began to understand this too late. Deborah stepped forward, not in defiance, but in interruption. She positioned herself between Tony and the center of the pressure, refusing to back down. She didn't speak to the entity. She didn't ask. She simply remained. The reaction was immediate. The pressure lessened for a moment, as if the house recognized that different stance. Images violently invaded Deborah's mind. The botched surgery, the child's panic, hands that were too firm. Decisions made without listening. It wasn't just death that filled the house, it was the denial of pain. Deborah understood that the climax didn't require confrontation, but a break from the pattern. She didn't try to free the entity, nor confront it. She simply removed Tony from the role the house had imposed on him. With extreme effort, he dragged it toward the front door. Every meter advanced seemed resisted by the entire structure. Doors slammed shut, objects were thrown, the floor vibrated. The house reacted with increasing violence, trying to keep the cycle intact. At the last moment, when the pressure reached its peak, Deborah released Tony and turned back to the inside of the house for a brief moment. There were no words. Just a silent acknowledgement of what that place had become, a space that survived on the repetition of pain. That gesture was enough. The pressure ceased abruptly. A heavy, almost unnatural silence fell. Tony managed to move. The door opened with difficulty, as if it were being forced open. They left together. Behind them, Sallie House remained motionless. No sound, no reaction. Just the clear feeling of something interrupted, unresolved, but deprived of continuity. The climax ended neither with a clear victory nor with destruction. It ended with retreat, and with the certainty that for the first time the house had been thwarted in its purpose. Leaving Sallie House wasn't a celebration, nor did it bring an immediate sense of relief. What followed was a strange emptiness, as if something had been left behind, not just inside the house, but within themselves. The silence outside that place seemed too vast, almost artificial, after months of living with a constant presence. Tony spent weeks recovering. The wounds finally began to heal, but the scars remained visible, not only on his body. He avoided talking about the house, not out of denial, but out of belated recognition. The need to prove himself, to understand at any cost, had vanished. In its place remained a permanent caution, an awareness of limits that he had previously refused to accept. Deborah adapted differently. Fear didn't follow her out of the house, but vigilance did. She began to realize how certain environments carry stories that don't belong only to the past. The experience didn't make her more gullible, but more attentive. She learned that not every silence needs to be filled, nor does every pain need to be investigated to exhaustion. Sallie House remained empty for a while. No official announcement, no detailed public explanation. Just scattered comments, incomplete accounts, and the lingering reputation the house had built over decades. For some, nothing there had been proven. For others, there was no need for proof. The relationship between Deborah and Tony never returned to what it was before. They stayed together for a while, united more by shared survival than by comfort. Over time, they went their separate ways, not through a violent break, but through a mutual understanding that that place had altered something essential in both of them. The long-term consequences manifested themselves silently. Tony never again engaged in similar investigations. Deborah avoided old houses, not out of superstition, but out of respect for what might remain dormant in certain spaces. Sallie House continued to exist, immobile, appearing, with no outward signs of change. But something had been interrupted. Unhealed, unresolved, simply deprived of continuity. And sometimes that's the most one can do when faced with something that never asked to be understood, only repeated. Years later, Sallie House still stood on the same quiet street in Atchison. Tourists passed by, curious onlookers took photos, occasional investigators came and went without major incident. There were no constant reports of attacks, nor intense demonstrations like before. Just a persistent unease, difficult to explain. Some said the house had become quiet, others believed it had simply learned to wait again. There was no consensus, only the feeling that something there remained watchful. On quiet nights, when the street was empty and the lights went out, the interior of the house seemed to absorb the surrounding sound. No voices, no clear movement, just the impression that the cycle had been interrupted, but not ended. Stories like that of Sallie House aren't just there to scare you. They raise difficult questions about the limits of human curiosity and the boundary between investigating and violating. Not every mystery requires an explanation. Some simply demand distance. If this story stirred something in you, fear, doubt, or reflection, share what you felt. Do you believe that certain places hold marks that shouldn't be revisited? Or can everything be understood if we persevere enough? Share your opinion, tell us where you're following this story from, and say, would you have stayed or left? Your perspective can reveal more than any evidence.